This time, on An Architect's Perspective, I sit down with the architect Nondita Mehrotra to explore the Gandhi Memorial Museum in Ahmedabad, one of Charles Correa's earliest and most defining works. We discuss how Correa used local materials and responded to the climate to help define Indian modernism. Nondita also reflects on what it was like growing up as the daughter of one of India's most famous architects. Let's take a listen.
We're here in Boston today to chat with the architect Nondita Mehrotra. Today we'll be diving into a fascinating conversation with her about the Gandhi Memorial Museum, designed by her father, the legendary architect Charles Correa, and completed in 1963. Nondita, thank you for joining us here today. Could we please begin with you telling us about the museum's location in Ahmedabad and its connection to Gandhi's life and the Indian freedom struggle?
When Mahatma Gandhi came back to India after he was in South Africa for some years, he started the ashram on the banks of the Sabarmati River, which is the main river that flows through Ahmedabad. This was a kind of a large piece of land. It was about 7 acres. And he set up a community there, an ashram, which basically he was sort of practicing how to get people off the grid, being self-sustaining. And he lived that way from 1917 to 1930. And then he started the Satyagraha movement, which is civil disobedience. And the first thing he set out to do really was this march to Dandi, which is further down the coast in Gujarat, and to make salt, to produce salt, which was against the law by the British. You had to buy British-made salt. And so he started off, I understand, with about 70 or 80 followers. And within a few weeks, the British arrested 60,000 people.
Right.
So that's the way the movement just took off. And he said, I will not come back here to the ashram until India gets independence.
Yeah.
And he never did come back because
Yeah.
then went partition and then he was assassinated.
Yeah.
So it's an important place as almost kind of has a spiritual connotation to it because of who the man was and what he did from that moment onwards. It was,
Can you explain how the opportunity to design this specific Gandhi Memorial Museum came about?
He was, I think, about 28 years old, and there was a competition to design the Mahatma Gandhi's Samadhi, which is a kind of resting place for the ashes after cremation. The cremation had, of course, taken place when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in 1948. Yeah. So this was a long time later. I think they had looked at other architects and stuff, and finally decided to have a competition. Charles was part of G.M. Butta's office, and they competed. The design went to someone else because Charles had written in the proposal that he felt that every generation needed to build something anew as a way of making the connection to the Mahatma.
Yeah. So he won in competition.
So he didn't win that competition, but because Nehru said we need something more finite. I don't like the idea of adding to it, as the years go by. But one of the jury was a friend, I understand, of Mahatma Gandhi, Kasturbai Lalbai, who was also a mill owner and stuff, and he was a trustee of the archives, and they knew they wanted to build a museum. And so Kasturbai Lalbai came to Mumbai to meet with Charles and said, would you do it? I like the idea very much. And so Charles started working on this memorial museum.
And Nondita, before we take a deeper dive into some of the influences behind the Memorial Museum, could we talk a little bit about maybe the creative life that you were brought into with your mother in textiles and what life was like living with such a successful architect?
Well, I suppose one doesn't really know that growing up. I think you just figure that's your family, but Charles he worked very hard, I think, but when he came home, he relaxed completely, and he also got us involved somehow in all his travel that he had to do for work. So we traveled a lot with him. We were never sort of really left behind. And so I think that's partly why I became an architect, was because I was taken to sites at a very young age and sort of learned to experience all that,
Your father, Charles Correa, was entrusted with the task of designing the Gandhi Memorial Museum, a project that wasn't merely about constructing a building, but about encapsulating the very essence of Gandhi's life and ideals. Can you take us through how he approached the challenge of creating a space which honours the legacy of such a significant figure within the 20th century?
He thought a lot about, I know, the materials that were used. I had asked him that once, and he said one of the things he thought was that glass wouldn't be right for Mahatma Gandhi. And so he developed these very large louvers which pivot, but they are fixed in place, so they still stay as a security kind of, barrier, but they allow cross ventilation. They allow the air to move right through. So it was a way of thinking that would be of a very humble person, but a great leader. They were very simple buildings, but it was also what India was going through at that time. There were no materials except the simplest materials to construct with. There was no air conditioning. Everyone was trying to build within very frugal means, let's say.
Yeah. Can you reflect upon how much of it is a museum, how much of it is a memorial, how much of it maybe is a celebration, how much of it is an archive of Gandhi's possessions, albeit limited? Maybe you could just help us understand what we would see if we were there today.
It really is his archives. It's his writings, which Gandhiji wrote prolifically because he was in jail for so much of the time. He would write his ideas down. So it is his writings. It is their photographs of Gandhiji at different places. It's all that material. There's a permanent exhibition. Charles designed those stands as well, and now I think the stands aren't there anymore, but they were very of their time, the sort of late 50s, early 60s, all in plywood. I think no screws or nails were used. It was just the plywood notching and making these bases for the photographs and the writings to be viewed. Again, no glass. All of it was open. In that dry climate, it works somehow.
Yeah. I think Charles has spoken quite a bit about sort of the permeability of his work and being able to just step into the building and wander through it. And it strikes me that if you look at photos of the museum, there's no sort of boundary walls. It's very sort of open, if you like, to the rest of the site. That's obviously a conscious decision, but I think it strikes a chord with some of his other projects that we'll be talking about, this notion of publicness. And I just wonder also whether, whilst your father was researching the text of Gandhi and such like, did that sort of set out his stall for his own spiritual journey at all? And some of the stories behind his building, how did that percolate for the rest of his career, I suppose?
The idea of the openness is correct. It is very open. There are no doors to the building, but there's a raised plinth. And when you see the building as you approach it, it kind of floats. The plinth beam, or the beam that kind of goes right around the building, it's cantilevered away from the columns. So you never actually see it, at least around the entrance. It's just a floating beam which you step up. And so you can leave your sandals, whatever, outside and then, step up into the thing barefoot. It's partly a sign of respect to the Mahatma, And
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's
the level change.
the level changes.
Okay.
So it's just leaves the ground behind, and you
Okay.
step up. It's a very small step, but it's a very clear line that you see, and the lawn and stuff tucks in under this thing, so that you don't feel connected so much to the ground. It just lifts off.
It's interesting. I hadn't realised it was a direct sign of respect to the Mahatma. So you take your shoes off and then you step up and there's pictures of sandals and such like being left. And if we could just describe building, from what I understand, it's a concrete slab that's raised above the rest of the sites.
Yeah.
And the main structure is effectively 4 columns with what I would call a concrete capping beam made from rather rough concrete. And that ties the sort of the brick sort of columns in each corner in. And then we have a pitched roof on top with some, what I think is quite elegant detailing of the timber underneath that. So the materiality is brick, concrete, timber roof. Is that how you describe it?
From the exterior, it's the terracotta tiles that are used right through rural India and in those days in many of the cities as well.
Yeah.
It's very simple materials, and even the flooring is a gray Kota stone, which is quite local. It's from Kota, which is not far from Ahmedabad, and it's a very soft gray without any grain in it, so that it's not busy at all. It's very simple. It's really very simple, and because you're barefoot and stuff, it's very soft and quite sensual in a way, but it's just that you're very much in touch with the materials used.
Of course, when Louis Khan was invited to come to Ahmedabad and build a number of buildings, he instantly picked up on the same sorts of materials, brick, concrete, and such like. Can you just talk about how that brick would have been, the materiality behind that, where it would have been made, and any other thoughts about that particular brick, because it's a very dominant feature within the building?
As far as I know, the clay in Gujarat around Ahmedabad and stuff is of a very high quality. So there's a lot of clay construction. There's a lot of local brick being made.
So your father was he was in his 30s at this particular time of the Gandhi Memorial building, and he went on to win the RIBA gold medal. But I think it's been published, and I'd be interested to hear your view, that it was this particular building that may have catapulted his international career because of the significance of the brief and who the sort of client was and such like. Would you agree that this was one of the first buildings that catapulted his international career?
Yes, I think so, because it was a very important commission. It wasn't a big commission in the sense that it wasn't, it was most probably a very low budget kind of building, but it was a very important commission to receive.
Yes.
And then I think it turned out well, and so people started taking notice. It was something that seemed to have picked up the ethos of Gandhi.
So we move on somewhat to the era of post-colonial architecture. Could you help us understand how architects like Charles helped to start shape a new identity for Indian architecture? From what I understand, you've got Nehru as the Prime Minister of India. He had a notion of a pan-Indian architecture, a language. There's talk about Le Corbusier's social progressive ideals were of interest to Nehru. But maybe you could talk a little bit about your father's contribution to the new Indian modern.
Yeah, I think when Charles returned from studying in the US, India was, just 8 years after independence. So I think Nehru particularly was very keen on having a very distinct modernist language that would unite the country, that would see it as being sort of more focused on its future than its past. And there was actually a symposium that was organized by the Indian Institute of Architects in 1958, where Nehru gave the keynote address and talked about this vision. And then several architects spoke. Charles was one of them at 28, and he talked about what he saw as the essence of Indian architecture and how that could fold into a modernist vocabulary. And I think he spent the next 6 decades of his life really trying to develop that, picking up on some of the vernacular, but really transforming it into a much more modernist vocabulary.
So this conference was sort of laying out Charles's manifesto of the future of India.
It turned out that way.
Yeah.
It was meant to be, and I'm sure the other architects took away their own bit, but I think it was very important for Charles to hear what the Prime Minister had to say, but also it kind of worked with the way Charles was thinking too.
Yeah. And with that in mind, Ahmedabad is one of the most fascinating cities as far as modern Indian architecture is concerned. Well, for me anyway. Can you explain how this particular city came to commission so many interesting international architects of that particular time?
Well, I think the business community in Ahmedabad, the mill owners in particular, are very enterprising, and they definitely were at that time. There was a man called Hati Singh who was head of the Mill Owners Association. And when he heard that Corbusier was coming to Chandigarh to design the new state capital and the whole new city, he asked him whether he would do the Mill Owners Association building. And Corb, as I understand it, said, I'd love to do it, but I need some other work in Ahmedabad to make it possible. Otherwise, I can't do a single building.
Very clever commercial move to say buy one, get one free or whatever it was.
So then Mr. Hati Singh commissioned a house for himself, which he, in the end, did not ever move into. He sold the drawings to the Shodhans, and so it became the Shodhan house. But it was actually a house, and if I understand it right, and I may not be correct on this, but I think Hati Singh was a bachelor. So it was a house that wasn't really meant for a whole family. But it's a beautiful house. And then other mill owners, including Kasturbai Lalbai, his sister, Maniben Sarabhai, commissioned the Sarabhai house. So they all kind of got together. But Kasturbai was the person who commissioned Charles to do the Gandhi Memorial. And then, of course, the museum that Corb designed. After that, I think it was easier than for other people in Ahmedabad to call in other architects. And Charles used to say a certain amount of risk-taking in commissioning a building, especially a building by an architect who is well-known, who has their own kind of set ideas of what a building should be. And you have to learn to kind of ride the tiger, once.
Them.
Yeah. And these were very good clients. Yeah. They just were willing to take that kind of risk.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. On that note, we now have a city with these incredible buildings. Have you any knowledge of the cross-pollination of ideas between the architects that we spoke about that have built in Ahmedabad? And to recap, Charles Correa, Louis Kahn, Le Corbusier, Doshi, etc., etc. What was the esprit de corps like at that particular time and the cross-pollination of ideas? Have you any knowledge of what took place? What did Charles learn from the other architects coming in? What conversations took place and such like?
Yeah, I think they all learned a lot. So Corb, as far as I know, his buildings in Ahmedabad were finished by about 57. I think in 1955 to 57 or 54 to 57 is when most of them were constructed and completed. I think Corb stopped coming to Ahmedabad after that. So there wouldn't have been an overlap between, say, Corb in Ahmedabad and Khan in Ahmedabad. Khan was commissioned only in 1960 or 61 to do the IIM campus. And then it started construction quite a lot later, and it was finished in about 72 or so. But that spirit, I think, stayed, yes, for a long time. Even today, I mean, for architects to go to Ahmedabad, like going to Chandigarh, it's just like a wonderful field trip,
Yes. The pollination of ideas across the Atlantic is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I think, the Trenton bathhouse has come up in conversation, designed by Louis Kahn, built in 1955, finished in 1957. I think it's important to point out the connection or potentially lack of connection between the ashram and this building. I think that's an important thing to reflect upon, because some people have thought that maybe Kahn took the ideas or vice versa. But is there a connection between the two buildings?
No, I don't think so. Khan had designed Trenton before the Gandhi Ashram and stuff. But the Gandhi Ashram, I think, the pyramidal roof and that basic unit comes from most of Indian vernacular architecture, whatever has pyramidal roofs. India doesn't have sort of gable roofs and stuff. They have either lean-tos or pyramidal roofs in tile like that, in exactly the same kind of terracotta tile. The Trenton bathhouse also, the base of the pyramid is very opaque.
Right.
These are columns, 8-shaped columns and then these beams. The Trenton bathhouse doesn't have the beams or anything. I think the influence of the Gandhi Ashram really comes from Japan. Charles had visited Japan by around that time, I think 58, 59, I have to check, or maybe early 61. Maybe he hadn't been to Japan yet, but he knew of that architecture. That was a bigger influence, I think, to him, if there was a foreign influence. But I think it was really came out of India. He was thinking a lot about what the architecture should be of this memorial to the Mahatma.
I think the other connection, your father's spoken quite a bit about it, the influence of the courtyard. You can see that obviously at the Gandhi Ashram, and you can see that as a theme throughout. Obviously, other architects have used it, of which we've mentioned, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the use of the courtyard in Charles's architecture and maybe some of the historic use of the courtyard in Indian architecture.
So that symposium I was talking about earlier of the Indian Institute.
With Nehru?
Nehru,
right.
yeah. That's where he talks about the courtyard, how important that would be as an element because of the cross-ventilation, because of all the reasons that they exist in the vernacular architecture. But also there's a section he would draw quite often, which was a section through the Red Fort in Agra. He talked about this fabric, a big velvet fabric that would be hung and suspended right across these courtyards. And there were rings on the edge of the courtyard where this velvet fabric could be stretched. And how that fabric trapped the cool air and also the warm air in the winter, because it can get really cold up north. And so using fabrics, using these devices to sort of modify the climate and make it more livable. That's what he was trying to do in much of his work. And at the scale of housing, he did a lot of housing through his career.
From what I see, the courtyard has been employed in the Gandhi Memorial Museum, but also whined on a number of years, and Charles's high-rise building. It seems to be that he's incorporated the idea of the traditional courtyard on a higher density building. Is that a correct interpretation?
You mean like in Kanchenjunga apartments?
Yeah.
He wrote an essay and he talked about his own work through this kind of lens or rubric of form follows climate. And he said that if you needed to have cross-ventilation, which you do, of course, in any kind of dwelling, you needed to somehow trap this air and bring it through. And so even the orientation of that building, which is the sea breezes in the city of Mumbai from east to west. So that's where the big cutouts are.
Yes.
And it's necessary then even the flat surfaces to create that kind of Venturi effect that draws the cool air through the apartments.
And there seems to be a connection with Unité de Habitation, with the balcony spaces. Would you say that's a fair reflection?
Yeah. And I think also the sense of these spaces which became kind of windows into the city. And you can see that sometimes even, I think, the British Council building in Delhi with the Howard Hodgkin mural within. That's a huge window that's into the city, and it's just, so the facade is not just a facade that it's not dynamic in the sense there are no moving parts, but there is movement in the mural. And that was a wonderful collaboration too, of using moments like that to connect spaces.
So the Gandhi Memorial Museum is still very much functioning today. You can go and see it. We will be going to visit it. It welcomes many international visitors every year. Given its significance, it's critical to preserve this building as a national landmark. In recent years, how is the museum performing? Are there changes that may have surprised your father in recent years, or alterations perhaps that we're seeing now in the museum?
Yes, there have been additions. I don't think he was so worked up about the additions because he expected the building to, it's more a map building that, of course, could add units and if the program required. But it's the maintenance of it that I think upset him, but it continues to upset, I think, many architects who visit it. I mean, there are parts of those concrete beams, the kind of gargoyles that you were describing, that are painted gray. There's,
And when did that take place?
That was before Charles passed away. He was quite livid, and he tried to reach people to say, why was this done? There was no real reason. They just didn't clean it, and therefore then suddenly decided to just paint it gray. Now, to remove that, you could, if there was the funding and stuff to do it, but also there needs to be the will of, whoever's
and the
running
knowledge.
it. I think the knowledge is there. I think there are a lot of conservation architects and stuff who would be able to do it. There's also tons of horrible kind of polish that's been added to the wood interior and in the ceiling. Yeah.
Conservation is somewhat subjective, how we should repair and maintain these buildings. Are we touching upon the Western philosophy of how we conserve buildings versus maybe an Asian Indian philosophy of how we should maintain our heritage? Because I was thinking about this. Charles spoke about, and I paraphrase in roundabout terms, the history of architecture in the sense that the Greeks, the Romans, you come down through Le Corbusier, and that's a way you kind of understand Western architecture. But for Indian architecture, you can't go that route, he said. He didn't say what the route was, but it's interesting if you think about the route of Western conservation and the potential route of Indian conservation and where they may differ.
Well, yes, he drew that as a kind of a diagram, but he said that really he thought that Indian architecture comes from another kind of lineage, and that was, say, the Ajanta caves. And basically the non-building, that's what got him thinking about buildings like Bharat Bhavan and Bhopal and stuff, which flow into the land. So it is a different approach in construction.
Maybe you could just talk about the caves for people that are not aware of the...
So the Ajanta caves were Buddhist caves in rural Maharashtra, so not far from Bombay, but yes, it's about 8-10 hour drive, so it's not close either. But they are in a hillside. They're beautiful caves that were occupied by the monks, Buddhist monks in the monastery, and they painted them. And many of them have very little light, and when you go in there, you have to kind of light a match just to be able to see this in a very dim light.
And this space would have been visited by Charles.
Yes, he talks about it often. And then the walkway, and that's what he calls the ritualistic pathway, that's not just in that structure, but in others, whether it's the Sanchi Stupa, whatever, it's moving around, either circumambulating the space in case of the stupa, or that kind of way of meandering through, which is also picked up in the Gandhi Ashram. What is that movement through these units? Some which are enclosed with the archive, some are open, but it's that kind of looseness in the architecture, which he felt was very much part of India.
The Charles Correa Foundation continues to play an important role in preserving, promoting architectural discourse in India and globally. What is the foundation currently focused on, and what are the plans for its future?
So Charles started the foundation a few years before he passed away. It was mainly to somehow get involved with improving the urban conditions in India, designing sort of one's way through, either doing projects in Panjim where the foundation is involved, and you're really sort of using Panjim as a crucible, I'd say, for urban design and finding urban solutions. We did do that for a few years, but then we realized that one is, I don't think the state government in Goa was that interested in continuing with those designs or improving the city as we saw it. They had other ideas, in their agenda. And so we have really worked with setting up, like through conferences, through a series of films that we make and stuff, looking at issues in urban India, but on a pan-Indian scale. So we've had a series of conferences. We organize them every 2 years,
You have
biennially.
one coming up. Would you like to say a bit about what's around the corner?
Yeah, some of them before have been things like designing equitable cities, or in a case of Charles's, the buildings that he designed, which are, he called form follows climate, as a kind of provocation to architects to say, why can't we design buildings that are more sensitive to the surrounding climate and stuff. So we have done those in the past, but this time round it's kind of quite special because it is just on him and his contribution both to architecture and urbanism, to education, and to being a citizen, who spoke out about what civil society should engage with. He was very outspoken through his writings as well. So he was a prolific designer, but he also wrote a lot. So we have 21 speakers from around the world and many from India, of course, who will talk about his contribution now, some years later, but looking at the 6 decades of his practice. Yeah, there's one other thing I'd like to mention that we do at the foundation is we started something called C20, which is a 20th century architecture. And we thought it was imperative that we listed these buildings, and we've asked architects from different states in the country to list the buildings that they think are important in their state. And we feel that this way, once you have them listed, then you have to pass legislation, and that's a lot of work that's not so easy to do.
So this is your work in the foundation that's reached out to the architects requesting their preference for what buildings should be listed.
Yeah, just because there's no way we can just do that. And we actually started off trying to just mobilize architects, saying that we didn't want to do this at the foundation because people would say, oh, yes, of course, Charles Correa's buildings are listed there because it's his foundation. But we just felt like we just needed to mobilize people and it would happen. So we set up a website. We coined this term. We had these meetings online for over a year, I think, but not very much was done. And we then stopped because people just weren't coming forward with this. So I think partly the profession is not gearing up to the possibility that these buildings might be knocked down, or some have already been knocked down. And, what happened with the Hall of Nations of Raj Rewal's building is that when it went all the way to the Supreme Court, they didn't even hear the case. They just said they couldn't hear the case because the law does not exist to safeguard any building that's less than 75 years old. At that time, India was not...
This is pan-Indian law, is it?
Yes, pan-Indian law. At that time, India wasn't 75 years old, and I just read this and I thought, this is crazy. This means that there's nothing in modern India, of independent India, that is worth then even listing. So we need to list these buildings, but because otherwise, every time, whether it's IIM, those hostels going to be knocked down, or the stadium,
IIM by Khan,
yes. Yeah. Then there's this big uproar, and this letter goes around. Everyone's supposed to sign it, but that's not the way. The way to do it is to it's always on your back foot. And I think it's important that we list these buildings. We try and get the legislation through, and then the ones definitely that are in the public domain could easily be saved, like the stadium. I don't see any reason why that, or now the Gandhi Ashram, I don't know who is really responsible for preserving it. Say some of it gets, because of some other development, needs to be knocked down. Or you'll see now the bank of the river has moved because of the kind of river improvement project, has moved quite a distance away in all that land.
Further out or further?
Further out. So they've kind of channelized the Sabarmati River, which was a huge, very wide, dry bed. In the dry season would be a trickle of the river, but all that has gone. But all I'm saying is that there are changes happening. No one has touched the building as of yet, but it can happen. It's in any of these buildings can get knocked down.
And to wind back a little bit to your earlier point, the foundation is trying to gather that information, find out from the local architectural community what buildings are important to them, and to try and establish a register or a list for future generations to try and maintain.
Right. I mean, to asking locally in the state is only important that we don't leave out. I mean, we're not just looking at buildings that are known right across the country, but there may be a small building in a smaller city or something that we have not realized is an important building in that part of the country. For that reason, we were thinking that getting local lists done. So it's not citywide. It has to be statewide because that's how the law can be changed. So once we get a few states to list these buildings and stuff, then we can go to the central government and say, look, it's important to have at a union level, have these buildings protected.
Because in the UK, if your building's listed, that's a certain status. You can't touch it by law, but this is just almost at this stage an informal list with no legal protection around that particular. It's almost like a nomination in a way.
Exactly.
Right.
That's where we are in India. So that's why anyone can go in, especially a private owner could just go in and knock down a significant building.
Well, we wish you all the best in that endeavor.
Thank you.
So Nondita, as a practicing architect and the daughter of Charles Correa, how would you view your father's work today? What do you see his most significant contribution to architecture is?
I mean, of course, there are a few buildings that would stand out, but really, if you look at his work and his approach, I think he was very much a humanist. He saw buildings as a way to be able to improve society, to make it more equitable. He used the term a lot. He never liked the disparity between affluence and poverty. He was always trying to uplift the human condition. So a lot of the housing he did was about, incremental growth so that people could get the basic thing of a roof over their head. And that's sometimes all the government loans could deliver. But that over time, the incremental growth would allow for people to grow to cover their requirements, and that he thought was very important. They didn't have to move, that you then allowed communities to, exist with the connections that were already there, that you didn't have to uproot someone to move to another part of the city.
Lastly, if Gandhi were in this room today and we asked him about the museum dedicated to his life and work, what do you think he would say about it?
I don't know. I hope he would like it, that he would understand as I was talking earlier about the materials used, the sensitivity to all that. But I do know that Nehru, who knew him well, who opened the building in 1963, he said that he thought that Gandhiji would really appreciate the building because it reflected his spirit. And I think Charles always felt that was like the greatest compliment, because that's what he wanted it to do. Yep.
Nondita, it's been a real privilege hearing about your father's work, your work in the foundation, and your passion for architecture and conservation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, James.
Next time on An Architect's Perspective, I sit down with Professor Rahul Mehrotra to explore the Patel Stadium in Ahmedabad, one of Charles Correa's boldest structural experiments. We unpack how Correa manipulated scale, space, and structure to create a building that remains a vital part of India's architectural identity. The full video will be available on YouTube if you'd like to watch, or if you prefer to listen, just search for An Architect's Perspective wherever you get your podcasts.